first name. Laura, are you ready to present?
Yes, thank you very much, Jenny. I will start right now. Okay, thank you very much. Good afternoon to this last session of the day. I think that my presentation won't be very long, I guess. So thank you for being here at this conference. So I'm going to speak, as Jenny said, and the title says, about the production and circulation of literature for women between Europe and America, and a perspective from the Hispanic-American world. First, I must say that scholarship about the production and circulation of what was called, or what we call literature for women, and about the making of female readership in the 18th century has resulted nowadays in numerous studies about different cultural and geographic spaces. This presentation, therefore, is a first step towards the study of the production of circulation of books aiming at female readership, focusing on the relationship between Spain and New Spain and its connections with Europe. So, the aim of this research, which I am still starting, so I really appreciate any comments, ideas, and suggestions, is to evaluate the similarities and differences in the production of literature for women between both spaces, between New Spain and Peninsular Spain. I want to study to what extent did that literature travel, potentially both ways, although it is easier to trace the works that moved from Europe to America than the other way around. How were the contents and forms of these books adapted via translations or reprints? If there was a marked difference in the balance between religious and secular literature on the two shores of this Hispanic empire, and what was the gender dimension of the commercialization and distribution of books between colonial Latin America and Europe, a commercialization which has already been widely analyzed through the registers of traders, shipments, bookshops, etc. So the aim is not to contrast sharply between indigenous and imported literature, but rather to interrogate the appropriations and specific forms in which so-called literature for women was shaped in different parts of the Hispanic world. So here I have just drawn a map with this to exemplify this idea of these connections of both sides and the connections with Europe. So now I'm going to speak about the sources that I have used and that I'm still using. First of all, I have focused on the comparison of two multi-volume bibliographic catalogues, catalogues from the 19th century and the 20th century, so from nowadays. On the one hand, there is José Toribio's compilation of all books published in colonial Latin America since the first presses. It's a collection of more than 20 volumes published between the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. And among them, I have used the part that's focused on Mexico specifically during the 18th century. And on the other hand, I have used Francisco Aguilar Piñal's bibliography of Spanish books production during the 18th century. This book that you can see on the right is also a collection of several books. That includes the production of Spanish authors and translators during the 18th century. So this first approach will be a macroscopic one that focuses primarily on the titles of the works that specifically address to women. So it's a research focused right now on these titles that specifically address to women. This allows to offer an estimate of the volume of books written for women in both spaces in the long 18th century, a relevant empirical evidence that has not been established up to now. Also, the periodical press had a key role in the circulation of books, and I have looked at advertisements in journals such as the Gazeta de México. Here is an example of one of these parts of the this newspaper where you can see these books advertisements, where to analyze which books were given publicity, were where they published, and when possible, with readership they targeted, which is not always easy to, does not always appear, but sometimes it does. So here it is just a selection of one of these numbers of these Gazeta de México advertising, if I don't remember, yes, Las Veladas de la Quinta. So it's an example just of a novel advertised in this diary, in this newspaper. So during this presentation, first I will explain briefly what we understand as literature for women and how that category can be used and analyzed during the 18th century. So it's more like a methodological and theoretical approach. And secondly, I will focus on some of the first ideas and conclusions that I have obtained from the comparison of both spaces, of Spain and New Spain. So, as it is well known, during the 18th century, there was a diversification of reading publics, a broadening and reformulation of the public sphere of opinion, and changes in the publishing market, like the distribution of books in smaller formats, lower prices, larger print runs, etc. In this context, women emerged as potential audience to whom authors, translators, journalists, as among other agents, oriented some of their works. Female target audiences, of course, did not just mirror the reality of women's reading practices, which were strongly limited by low literacy rates, usually distributed across the social spectrum according to rank, class, and race, both in Spain and New Spain, and in other spaces, of course. From what can be seen in the sources, there were different categories of women to whom the different agents involved in the publishing world addressed their works. Categories constructed according to the type of text, the intellectual and commercial intentions of these different agents, like authors, printers, booksellers, and the variegated social and normative profiles they targeted, like mothers, educators, healthcare providers, religious women, young women or pupils, etc. It is also essential to bear in mind that the notion of literature for women should not always be interpreted in a literal sense, as I think that, for example, Carolina's paper has explained. Since authors, translators, and other agents assimilated the idea of a female audience to different types, like non-specialized audiences, like children, youth, or like readerships, which did not necessarily have to be made up specifically of women, but of non-experts. So it was a metonym for larger readerships. This category also gained much strength in the 18th century. So with these methodological considerations in mind, therefore, I wonder what type of female audiences do we find addressed in these works from Spain and New Spain, and if there were differences between the female readerships targeted by works published in New Spain and in Peninsular Spain. So I will offer now just some very preliminary conclusions based on the tentative exploration of the production of Spanish and New Spanish printing presses during the 18th century, and in the works, either original or translated, printed in the metropolis in Europe or in America, that were advertised in the Gazeta de México. So, first of all, with this first comparison, this first approach, the first thing I can appreciate is that the vast majority of literature, although it's original works or reprints, published in New Spain in the 18th century, that was explicitly addressed to women, is religious literature. It's that one. These works specified in their titles that they were especially recommended for nuns and religious women in general, or from some religious order in particular. So here there is one example of one of these works that is, as it says here underlined, is proposed to the souls, especially religious women virgins. In this case, this example is interesting because it's one of the examples that I have found of a first edition in Mexico, written in Mexico, and then the second edition is printed in Seville. So it's a book that was originally printed in New Spain, and then the second edition was printed in Spain. So it's interesting. And it's one of the books that was, well, now I don't know if this one was advertised in the Gazeta de México, but it's one of these examples of this travel from America to Europe. So this question may mean that this overwhelming literature, religious literature for women, we can say more than the one produced in Spain at that time and from the rest of Europe, maybe can relate it to the strongly clerical character of the Enlightenment and the intellectual elites in Hispanic-American. In the case of Spain, a priori, although in the 18th century religious works, of course, still represented a vast majority of publications, we find a little more variety within this literature, within, for example, pedagogic literature, including that addressed to women, and therefore different types of female publics addressed by Spanish authors. And here I have another example, for example, in this case related to domestic issues. This book by Manuel de los Artes is Domestic Academy, oriented to fathers and mothers of the family, let's say some literal translation, that was published in Spain and then traveled to Mexico and was advertised in the Gazeta de Mexico, in this case, 10 years later. So about this, must be said that in the case of Spain, we must also keep in mind that the literature that was published in Spain addressed to women was not only the literature published by Spanish authors, also by Spanish translators of other works from the rest of Europe, Italian, French, English literature. And this literature normally was translated in Spain, and then from there it traveled to America. So these works also arrived to America, but normally they were not printed for the first time in America. They were printed in Spain, and then they traveled to America. So, as for the possible changes that took place during the 18th century, this is a question that I have not yet to analyze in depth. From a first glance, in the case of New Spain, I can observe a certain decrease in the number of religious texts, or rather the appearance of another type of literature of a patriotic nature by the end of the 18th century, or more by the beginning of the 19th century, in which women seem to have been important and very relevant subjects. But for the moment, there is not much more that I can say about it because I have not analyzed it in depth. And a second element that is, I think, that is very interesting from this is that when comparing the production of this type of literature between Spain and New Spain, is that although religious women are overwhelmingly present as target audience in these books in New Spain, women did have an active participation in the publishing world. The role they played in the sphere as active agents in the book production process is striking, whether as sponsors or patrons, many of them religious, or printers, some as printers' widows, continuing the business under their husbands' names, and others with their own names that were very important printing presses in New Spain, such as María Fernández de Jáuregui or María de Rivera. And here there is an example, the third example, of one of the books that was printed in the press of María Fernández de Jáuregui, for instance, which is a book, in this case, related to midwifery, that was printed in Spain and then traveled to Mexico. It was sold in Mexico, but there was also a new reprint in New Spain, in Mexico, and then this version advertised in the Gazeta in 1807, in this printing press from María Fernández de Jáuregui. So, in Spain, although the role of women was also fundamental in the publishing world, female patrons were more often lay women, and the use of their own name by female printers was less common. So finally, yes, I am finishing. It is important to bear in mind that all this data should be taken with caution, since the reality of the distribution of texts addressed to women must have been much more complex. First, beyond the world of books, there were other forms of circulation of ideas, such as debates in the periodical press, that must also be taken into account and that would offer a different perspective, of course. Second, in this tentative approach, I have looked only at works that specifically address a female audience in their title, without considering other explicit or implicit references to female readerships in the paratext, censorship reports, reviews, or recommendations. And third and last, the very category of literature for women itself, as this mezzanine for other types of audiences, remains to be further explored as this research progresses. And that's all. Thank you.